Good evening, everyone. Welcome again to the 11th Mama Charitable Foundation Visiting Professor in Buddhist Studies lecture series. The theme of the series this year is Curing Illness with Good Deeds in Chinese Buddhism. Today is the third and also the last lecture of the series, and we are very happy and honored to have invited Professor Stephen F. Teiser again to share with us his insight and wisdom. The topic for today's lecture is how curing takes place. Before the lecture begins, I'd like to invite Dr. Guangxin from Hong Kong Youth Center of Buddhist Studies to introduce Professor Teiser. Dr. Guangxin, please.
Good evening. I'm very happy to see so many people come here, and because of Professor Teiser. And Professor Teiser has been already introduced for the last 2 lectures. I'm sure I no need to read this script and these details. And I just say something from my bottom of my heart. Professor Teiser is a very good friend to the Center of Buddhist Studies. From the very beginning, he was so kind that he comes several times on our invitation and gave so many lectures. It was wonderful. Inspired so many of our students to apply Princeton University. So many. And a few of them, lucky enough, got into Princeton University. And one of them I still remember is Wu Wei. She graduated, and she's teaching in Emory University now. So she's setting up an example. And among all of you, I know our PhD student, try your best and imitate like Wu Wei. Go to there, some of our students. And among these books listed here, one of the books translated, in fact, several books translated into Chinese, but one of the books is getting very popular, and we call Ghost Festival. In Chinese, called 鬼节. And a lot of students and teachers really like that book because before the book was published in Chinese, we know that called Ulanban Festival, but we don't know the detail. We don't know. It was so popular during the Tang Dynasty, and even the emperors was, inspired and setting their bowls called Ulanban bowls to the temples. We don't know this kind of things. That's why we learned a lot. And even undergraduate student, talking about the book. It was so popular. And later on, of course, another book published, his second book, very important book, about the 10 kings in hell. That is also another wonderful book and translated into Chinese, I think. It's very popular. I hope in the future, because Professor Teiser has several very important books, to be translated into Chinese and benefit the Chinese audience and students. So I won't say too much. I just invite Professor Teiser to give his lectures, and also one of the very interesting lectures today, and building up from the first 2 lectures. Professor Teiser.
Good evening, everyone. I want to thank Professor Guangxin for that lovely introduction. It's been my honor to work with the Center of Buddhist Studies at Hong Kong U for a long time now. And I want to make one remark about the books that Professor Guangxin mentioned. The Ghost Festival in Medieval China, translated into Chinese as 幽灵的节日. By someone I did not know at the time. I had never met the translator, but he has since become a good friend. That book is much better in Chinese than it is in English. So I owe a special debt of gratitude to the translator, my friend and colleague, Professor Hou Xudong of Tsinghua Daxue. I want to thank the sponsor of this lecture series, the Mama Charitable Foundation, and I'm delighted to see Director Leon Kachai with us today. I also want to thank the Hong Kong Center for Buddhist Studies at HKU and its director, Professor Halkias. This is the third lecture in the series. I'm going to summarize briefly the first two lectures. And then I'm going to turn to the highlight of the project. I hope today's climax. I'll try to answer the question of how Buddhist rituals imagine curing to take place, how they conceive of this process, how they appeal to ideas and mobilize speech and action in order to bring about therapy. As you can see, I break my talk today into two main chunks, Part B on illness and Part C on epidemics. Part B deals with individual illness, and in Part C, I turn to how Buddhist rituals were employed to deal with epidemics or collective illness. Let me begin by restating the question I posed at the beginning of this lecture series. It's a modern question, but projected into the past. What were the fundamental healthcare options in medieval China? As we've seen, pre-modern China was home to numerous cultures of healing. Most of the therapies had become widely available by the early 6th century, when Guo Zushen, a highly placed official whom I quote here, outlined 4 different technologies, each tendered by a different specialist. According to Guo, Taoist priests practiced curing by writing formal petitions they dispatched to the appropriate functionaries in the divine bureaucracy. Buddhist monks and nuns employed another method, preaching sutras and presiding over rituals, thereby enabling sponsors to create merit and transfer it to their sick family members. A third group, consisting of local spirit mediums, exorcised the demons that were believed to cause illness. The fourth discipline was traditional medicine, in which doctors practiced acupuncture and prescribed herbs, drugs, or broth. In my second lecture in this series, I turn to the liturgical handbooks preserved in the cache of texts discovered at Dunhuang in northwest China in the year 1900. I use them as my main source in this series because they were unparalleled insights for us into how Buddhist monks plied their trade of therapy in China's medieval period. We're talking roughly the year 600 to the year 1000. I noted that among the roughly 60,000 manuscripts discovered at Dunhuang, almost 2,000 individual manuscripts contain one or more liturgies or ritual texts. Within this broader genre, which it calls itself Jaiwan, about 125 manuscripts contain the subgenre of healing liturgy or text for sickness, Huanwan. The healing liturgies were compiled by local Buddhist monks. Acting in a priestly capacity, they administered rituals in which sponsors created good fortune and then dedicated the good results to their loved ones in need. We know that such transactions were widespread across Buddhist civilizations, but the standard accounts that have been edited at the highest echelons and preserved in canonical literature divulge very few details about the actual proceedings or the words that were actually spoken in the rituals. These canonical sources remain vague about the process of curing. By contrast, the liturgical handbooks elucidate the dynamics of what medical anthropologists nowadays call the clinical encounter. I borrow this term from anthropologists including Judith Farquhar. Defined as the interaction between healer and patient, the clinical encounter is an open-ended process involving first clinical signs and patient complaints, moving on to the identification of symptoms, assessment of syndromes, and administration of therapies. This is where the medieval liturgies are particularly helpful. The words spoken during rituals disclose the variety of models for understanding and treating illness. They offer insight into the turns of speech and multiple patterns of thought that were used in the past to ameliorate suffering. In my second lecture, I also explored how Buddhist liturgies establish the basic components of the healing situation. These oral texts name the sponsor and praise the Buddha. They explain the purpose of the rite. They state what offerings are being made. They orchestrate the transfer or dedication of benefits to the sick person, and they end with a prayer or benediction. Today, I'm going to focus on the portions of the liturgy that describe the patients, section 3, and their recovery, section 6. I will argue that these passages make sense of illness and rationalize its multifarious causes. Beyond this diagnostic function, the ritual performance establishes expectations about treatment and narrates the process of healing. In addition to leading participants through scenarios of recovery, the liturgies open new horizons of time and space, enlisting future lives, as well as other people and sentient beings in the enterprise. So the third section of the healing liturgy performs a diagnostic function when it talks about the patient or the sick person. According to the dictionary, the English dictionary, Webster's, the American English Dictionary, Webster's, diagnosis is, quote, the act or art of identifying the disease from its signs and symptoms. This part of the ritual text identifies symptoms, names illnesses, and explains mental and physical discomfort. Unlike diagnosis in modern biomedicine, however, the liturgies define illnesses in ways that are polythetic and holistic. That is, numerous intersecting explanations are provided, and they address the whole person. Consider, for example, the surfeit of symptoms in these three couplets we see in the first selection, liturgical text number 1. Now, fire and wind disagree, earth and water work against each other, illness taints the 5 emotions, sickness envelops the 6 cavities. Recently, he, the sick patient, often resorted to medical treatment, but there's been no cure. He fears faults from a former age produce enemies in his present lifetime. Assaulting the 5 organs at sunrise and sunset, he's ill at ease. Damaging the 4 limbs, morning and night, it's hard to bear. So the first couplet here draws on both Buddhist and indigenous Chinese medical terminology to depict what's wrong with the patient. The 4 great elements or qualities, Sanskrit Mahabhuta, earth, water, fire, and wind, comprise the material world in Indian medical thought, and their imbalance results in sickness. The second full line of the stanza involves basic, long-standing terms from the Chinese tradition, the 5 emotions of happiness, anger, grief, joy, and resentment, and the 6 cavities, a hallowed medical term, probably refers to the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine, the gallbladder, the urinary bladder, and what the text calls the burner, perhaps the thorax. The purpose seems to be to portray sickness evocatively by robustly deploying overlapping vocabularies. The second stanza invokes further etiologies and possible treatment regimens. The liturgy points out that medical intervention, ingesting medicine and undergoing acupuncture, has been tried and resulted in no improvement. In the aftermath of such failed therapy, the text broaches another reason for the patient's suffering. Maybe he committed evil deeds or wronged people in a former lifetime, and they've returned now to exact revenge. As we'll see in a minute, later sections of the liturgy offer distinct scenarios for massaging away or zapping each of these sources of woe. The third couplet in this text bundles together physical, mental, and emotional descriptions to represent the experiential side of illness. Here, I think the language of 5 organs and 4 limbs, the 5 organs, the heart, liver, spleen, lungs, and kidneys, and the 4 limbs constituting the 2 arms and 2 legs, does not so much pinpoint precise parts of the body or viscera or biophysical locations. Rather, I think that the phrasing draws attention to sensoria, or general fields of perception. On the whole, the liturgies employ an empathetic register when confronting the experience of disease. As with most forms of suffering, if you think about it, pain is not usually localized. When we feel distress not in one particular region of our bodies, but rather through our whole person. Other liturgies identify the mind as the source of illness. As is well known, standard Buddhist epistemology posits 6 senses, each corresponding with a sense organ inside the body and an external perceptual field. Sight is constituted by the eye encountering visible things out there, and the same framework applies to hearing, smell, taste, touch, and thought. Thought occurs when the mind engages with ideas or concepts, things capable of being sensed by the mind. When it comes to the mind, ritual texts convey the importance of intention and the mental causes for sickness, not merely through scholastic formulas, but by using figurative language. And so one liturgy reads, as you see here, text number 2, "The monkey of the mind is unshackled, bounding through the forest of the 5 desires. The horse of thought is unbridled, set loose amid the 6 fields of dust." As a genre of performance liturgy, liturgies constitute sickness not only a personal experience, but also a social process. A liturgy entitled "For a Woman's Sickness," Dunhuang, pays special attention to the sentiments felt by members of the household as they deal with the mother's disease. The liturgy here, number 3, gives voice to collective suffering, the subjective experience of the group, not merely that of the individual patient. It reads, "Fearful jitters fill the house, medicine sought on every street. Her sons so disturbed they sprout white hair, her daughters doting, blemishes their rosy cheeks. Sympathetic hearts pained again and again. Everyone considers lamenting their kin." This liturgy makes clear that diagnosis, beyond simply interpreting illness, is also a method for addressing group fear. The text articulates the worries produced within the home. The woman's children are praised for their physical manifestation of inner turmoil. The liturgy guides the audience through a family drama, highlighting outward acts of devotion as well as the collective anxiety they all feel. So that's the diagnosis. Let's turn to how the liturgies narrate health. After diagnosing illness and venting distress in section 3, most healing liturgies turn in section 6 to prayers narrating a passage to health. The account here is neither a pure description of a future state nor a unitary storyline recounting crisis, adventures of a protagonist and other characters, climax, and a denouement. Instead, the prayer is a succession of short dramatic scenes, each involving different actors performing specific actions, often employing curative tools or special substances. The most popular healing liturgy at Dunhuang, which I introduced in Lecture 2, offers a wide range of prayers in this section. The text follows the usual paradigm in the transfer of merit, which is to grant 3 wishes, 3 cycles of benefits, to the sponsor of the ritual. The first request is usually the largest and longest, in this case dedicated to the curing of the patient. The first dedication of merit, as you see, contains 4 stanzas. It reads, "We pray that the 404 illnesses dissipate like clouds because of this merit. The 5 coverings and 10 bonds be extinguished on account of this." Stanza 2, "Medicine King and Supreme Medicine, that is Vaishajya Raja and Vaishajya Samudgata, confer magical prescriptions. Sound Observer and wondrous sound of Avalokiteshvara and Gadgadasvara bestow their wondrous medicine." Couplet 3, "Sickness of the body and sickness of the mind on this day be eliminated. Calm when sleeping and calm when awake. His rising and resting be light and easy." And stanza 4, "All his enemies and creditors, anyone to whom he owes money or life, share a portion of his merit and cease being adversaries, release the sickness, and return him to his former condition." Let's think more carefully about the poetics and pragmatics of this prayer. The wishes expressed in the first stanza include the curing of not only physical ailments, but spiritual maladies as well. In Indian medicine, the 404 illnesses are a standard way to represent all forms of disease, 101 for each of the 4 great elements. The liturgy adds soteriological improvement to the list of desiderata, extinguishing the 5 coverings that obstruct the mind, desire, wrath, dullness, agitation, and remorse, and extinguishing the 10 bonds or afflictions that keep people attached to impermanent things. These are lack of conscience, lack of shame, envy, parsimony, remorse, drowsiness, flightiness, slackness, wealth, and hypocrisy. In my interpretation, the ritual text is doing more than simply dressing sickness in doctrinal garb or conducting a crude karmic transaction between sponsor, priest, and patient. The second stanza dramatizes the process of healing by seeking help from deities known for their ability to cure illness. The brothers Medicine King Bodhisattva and Supreme Medicine Buddha Bodhisattva played important roles in healing throughout Asia. The second pair of bodhisattvas, Sound Observer and Wondrous Sound, by contrast, are invoked for the purpose of curing, from what I can tell, only in the Dunhuang manuscripts. Their role in the liturgy may be due to the popularity of the Lotus Sutra, which devotes an eponymous chapter to each of these 2 deities. As you know, many bodhisattvas manifest in whatever bodily form is most helpful to people seeking their divine intervention. If I may adopt modern terminology for a few minutes, the Buddhist pantheon offered a bevy of powerful healers, comparable perhaps to star doctors or approved healthcare providers in modern insurance networks. But not all of them figure prominently in Dunhuang healing liturgies. Perhaps the best doctor on the Buddhist medical team was the Buddha Vaishajya Guru. His name means thus, Vaishajya Guru Tathagata, whose name means thus come one, master of medicine, Yao Shi Fo Ru Lai. The so-called healing Buddha was popular across pre-modern Asia. For our purposes, it is especially noteworthy that the name of the master of medicine, the figurehead of the main figurehead of the Buddhist medical consortium, is nowhere invoked in the Dunhuang healing liturgies. So it's somewhat anomalous that I am using a Bhaishaja Guru painting from Dunhuang here on my slide, because this particular Buddha is not invoked in the healing liturgies I'm talking about. He was clearly important at Dunhuang. His cult was clearly important. His Pure Land in the East was clearly important. But he's not invoked in the healing liturgies. I was really surprised by this. It does seem that the entire staff of healers called upon in ritual texts operated on behalf of the healing Buddha or under his direction, perhaps, but without his direct participation. His function as an otiose doctor is consistent with his status as a Buddha, believed to now reside in a distant realm of the universe. Healing liturgies do seek treatment from a range of other doctor divinities. The most powerful among them are Buddhas. Liturgies invoke all the Buddhas of the 10 directions, thus come ones of the current world, thus come ones of the 3 ages, past, present, and future, and this world's Buddha Shakyamuni, often under the monikers of Great Man of the Himalayas, one of his previous incarnations as a healer, or Physician King of Vulture Peak. In the Mahayana pantheon, just below the rank of Buddhas stand bodhisattvas, saint-like saviors undergoing endless rebirth to bring palliation to sentient beings in need. The 2 most common pairs of bodhisattvas, Medicine King and Superior Medicine on the one hand, and Sound Observer and Wondrous Sound on the other, I've already noted. Some liturgies add a 3rd pair, namely the 2 bodhisattvas associated with Amitabha Buddha, the observer of the self-existent Avalokiteshvara Guanzizai, and possessor of great energy, or Mahastama Prapta. A lower level of healers consists of weaker demons and spirits divided into 8 classes of minor deities. Some of them were originally malevolent. All have been vanquished or convinced by the Buddha to serve as guardians, protectors, and healers. Other practitioners in the Buddhist consortium are more akin to doctors or nurses than to supernatural figures. Some prayers beseech the generic group worthies and sages, clearly indicating human beings. Help also comes from Buddhism's 2 most famous human healers. The first is Vimalakirti, the layman who plays the title role in the Vimalakirti Sutra. In that metaphysical drama, as you know, Vimalakirti feigns illness in order to teach the Buddha's disciples, even advanced bodhisattvas, the true meaning of emptiness and non-duality. The other healer is Jivaka, a bivalent figure in more ways than one. Jivaka's first incarnation was as a talented physician to the king of ancient India, Bimbisara, who dispatched him to attend to Shakyamuni's ills. Subsequent mythology considers Jivaka to be a long-lived disciple of the Buddha or a miracle worker whom latter-day Buddhists can summon still for curing. Leaving the medical team and returning to the 2nd stanza, the 2nd stanza also discloses that gods practice the art of healing not through faith or invisible grace, but by wielding particularly powerful tools. The liturgy describes the medicine and prescriptions provided by bodhisattvas as magical and wondrous, shen and miao. Their cures surpass mundane drugs in both power and comprehensiveness. In other liturgies, deities confer further substances, magical broth, good medicine, prescriptions, and talismans for avoiding death, and ghee, or clarified butter. Continuing with the third stanza of the healing liturgy, we move to another technique for narrating health. It offers scenarios for how the patient will feel as sickness disappears. The language in this liturgy is relatively spare, utilizing direct description and avoiding figures of speech. Sickness will simply be eliminated and the patient will be calm. By contrast, other liturgies employ metaphors and analogies to nature to help the implied patient visualize the curative process. Some images are relatively simple, positing, for instance, that the beneficiary will drink sweet dew to tame the mind, or that the body will be made solid by the wind. Unembellished similes proclaim that fortune or merit will gather like clouds, or that illness will vanish like melting ice. Some liturgies link natural symbols to Buddhist soteriology. Examples include ghee anointing the mind of the Dharma body. Yes, I was surprised about this as a student of Buddhist philosophy. Apparently, a Dharma body, which I thought was immaterial, also possesses a mind. Right? So you can have ghee anoint, the Dharma body has a mind which can be anointed with ghee. The Buddha sun, another metaphor, the Buddha sun cools and eliminates illness. The fire of wisdom incinerates the seeds of karma. The rain of Dharma fertilizes sprouts of the path. Sick people are illuminated by the rays of compassion. The rain of wisdom infuses, soaks into the body. The forest of depredations is chopped to pieces. All these involve either simple or compound metaphors. The cure envisaged in the liturgy's fourth stanza addresses the possibility that the patient's own prior deeds are causing the illness. The text proceeds to resolve the past conflict. The prayer explicitly divides up the merit produced by the ritual, assigns a portion of it to enemies, the sick person wronged in the past, and implores them to desist from further vengeance and to return the sick person to health. Similar prayers emphasize the importance of reconciliation between the two parties, asking the sender of illness to resolve enmity and untie the knots. In this fashion, liturgies for healing narrate many different paths to recuperation. I've noted that most healing liturgies allow for three different parties to benefit from the ritual: the sick person, the donor's family, and all sentient beings. Liturgies grant boons beyond merely healing illness, offering aid to an ever-expanding web of beings. The therapy is enlarging or aggrandizing, growing in several respects. Therapy lengthens or prolongs the curing of the patient across many lifetimes. It harnesses physical and mental healing to a more fundamental process of achieving enlightenment. And the circle of healing is widened to include people from past lifetimes and beings across a broad spectrum of life. Let's return to the most popular liturgy among the Dunhuang manuscripts, whose second wish you see here. It specifies the blessings to be enjoyed by the donor's family. It reads, "We pray that 1,000 disasters be terminated forthwith, and 10,000 fortunes arrive, old and young, fresh and easy, forever free of calamity. Here, the prayer makes clear that good luck and prosperity should rain down on different generations in the donor's family, not merely on the individual sponsor of the ritual. After that, the third wish stretches to embrace generations across time and space. In East Asian Buddhism, the family was a vast corporate network that included one's parents from former lifetimes. The standard limit is 7 previous incarnations. All those parents have now moved on to further lives as people, animals, or other species to whom one is no longer related, since in this lifetime one has been born to a new set of parents. The couplet for the third wish addresses these earlier parents. Next, it reads, "Next we pray that parents who passed away earlier will with their own eyes see the dragonflower tree," more on that in a minute, "and those born from womb or egg or the 4 forms of birth will together achieve the fruit of Buddhahood." This final prayer in the healing liturgy amplifies both the goal and the group that achieves the goal. The text prophesies the various summa bona sought in Mahayana forms of Buddhism. The first line of the couplet hopes that parents will attain rebirth in a realm graced by the future Buddha, Maitreya, who preaches the Dharma underneath the gentle canopy of a mythical dragonflower tree when he descends to Jambudvipa in his incarnation as Buddha. Buddhologically speaking, this is the penultimate level of rebirth. The parents will be members of a congregation assembled in front of a living Buddha. And since all Buddhas speak efficaciously, those who hear him will be empowered by his words to achieve final enlightenment upon their subsequent final rebirth. The second sentence here is even more explicit. All will become Buddhas, attaining the status of fully enlightened beings. The prayer sets the cosmological gyres spinning in their widest possible rotation. The 4 forms of birth define the means of parturition possible for most sentient beings. Birth as a mammal via the womb, as a bird or reptile oviparously, as an insect out of moisture, or as a god through magical transformation. The point is that even creatures far removed from the human realm, animals of all types as well as gods, will share the happy results of the curing ritual and achieve final enlightenment. On to the process of healing. I would argue that the liturgies I've discussed today serve the function of making sense of sickness. The ritual scripts are theodicies in that they provide a rationale for seemingly undeserved suffering. They draw on cosmological systems to emplace a patient's pain and confusion within a broader worldview. They draw repeatedly on different understandings of karma to rationalize sickness and its cure. The patient's past deeds may have resulted in illness. He might have wronged someone in a previous life, and the aggrieved party has now returned to infect him. Karma also undergirds the ritual. The donor's act of charity is a good deed that generates good results. That merit is in turn assigned to the patient as well as others. The process of curing also produces a new understanding of illness by stirring emotional ties to other people. Recall the liturgy for a woman's illness I cited that spotlights the anxieties experienced by her family, beginning with the words, "Fearful jitters fill the house." This phrasing doesn't refer to deities, causation, or cosmology. Instead, it evokes sentiment towards and within a particular group, the aggrieved family. Other liturgies, as we've seen, enjoin participants to dedicate the results of their deeds to successively larger collectivities, corporate groups, including relatives from past lives, future generations of people, and ultimately all sentient beings. These moves serve to frame social interaction, redefining the solution to individual suffering as the collective flourishing of the species, or of all species. Hence, the performance of ritual not only involves cosmology and emotion, but also the expansion of social boundaries. Another part of the healing process is conceptualizing good health as a journey over many incarnations, ending in enlightenment. Most liturgies envisage a conclusion well beyond merely curing today's illness. As we've seen, healing liturgies reassert a Buddhist understanding of the world, which includes long cycles of birth and death, the inescapability of morally graded cause and effect, that's karma, and the hope of ultimate salvation or enlightenment. Perhaps nirvanification would be an appropriate rhetorical term, or for the Buddhologists here, vyakaranification, a prediction of future, a prophecy of future enlightenment, to express the prediction of Buddhist enlightenment in the distant future. Buddhist healing rituals reconceptualize illness, offering the assuagements of a Buddhist worldview and a rationalization of suffering. Beyond explanation, however, the curing liturgies also remind us about the importance of performance, not simply explanation or discourse, but performance. The concept of performance helps us understand that, and here I'm quoting Stanley Tambaya, the cosmological scheme is not simply an abstract mapping in the mind. The meaningfulness of the healing situation stems from the enactment of the ritual and healing process that translate and create the cosmology. Thus, Tambaya. So it's one thing to posit that curing illness is a journey to enlightenment, but it's quite a different thing to actually undertake the trip. To go on the Odyssey, performance is essential. To some secular observers, to conceive of this life as one short phase of a journey stretching over many reincarnations may seem merely fantasy. It is worth noting, however, that even in modern times, both religious and medical practitioners credit the faculty of imagination with accomplishing results. In medieval Chinese Buddhism, such acts of the imagination constitute one technique among others. They are part of a tradition suffused with regimes of devotion, methods of visualization, and programs of mind-body training. The category of performance, therefore, helps us combat the scholarly tendency to approach religious activity if it were either a type of scriptural text to be analyzed or the mere physical execution of a pre-existing ideology. Following this lead, construing ritual as performance clarifies how pantheons or systematic relations between deities are created, not merely inherited. Healing liturgies call upon deities throughout the cosmos to engage in curative acts. The relevant gods are not always prepackaged in sets. To the contrary, most religious cultures in Buddhist Asia embrace a surfeit of gods, an abundance, an oversupply of deities and spirits, with gods and below them a whole pantheon of demons. Hence, rituals exercise the classificatory function of choosing which of those many deities to supplicate, generating their own set of gods via ritual performance. Until now, we've been looking at how merit is aimed in the first place at ailments of a single person, individual illness. Beyond this common problem of mortality, however, there's another way in which people share suffering. We all share suffering because we individually suffer illness at some point. But there's another way we share suffering, and that's through medical problems that afflict larger subgroups of the population. In the rest of my talk, I'd like to consider illnesses faced by everyone in a neighborhood, including epidemics and pandemics that are considered threats to the well-being of the community. Recent scholarship on the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrates the helpfulness of considering religion and epidemics through the same analytical framework. One benefit is a broadened conception of species and their interrelationships. We've already noted how merit can be shared between different generations of people. The editors of the Singapore-based research project Coronasur from 2023, the title is a concatenation of corona for the coronavirus and asura, the class of demigods and small demons in Buddhism. So from the Coronasur project, they extend this point of interrelationship beyond the human realm. They write, as you see here, relations of pandemicity, and this term derives from a scholar named Richardson. He coined it in 2020. Relations of pandemicity, that is, the social relationship of contagion across humankind and other species, have unsettled the purportedly discrete and self-contained individual, since they act at a global, interconnected, and interbodily scale. For scholars of religion, relations of pandemicity affect and infect not only humans and non-human animals, but also a wide range of other than human beings that participate in the cosmos, be it ancestral spirits, sacred plants, immanent energies, or even supernatural monotheistic gods. Widespread disease is, then, particularly suited to highlight the precarity of the boundaries that religious traditions normally posit when an entire population enjoys good health. As we will see, managing the effects of shared illness can reveal connections between humans and other species, be they animals or spiritual beings. So in discussing epidemics, first I'm going to introduce two dominant paradigms, what I'm going to characterize as a traditional Chinese paradigm first, and then secondly a Buddhist paradigm for explaining communal illness. After introducing these two models, I'll turn to liturgical materials from Dunhuang, asking what these manuscript sources reveal about concepts of public health and methods for treating epidemics. One of the most comprehensive and enduring paradigms for understanding collective health in China grew out of the political and philosophical synthesis engineered during the Han Dynasty, roughly 200 BC to roughly 200 AD. That system proposed a homology between the cosmos, the human body, and the state. In the words of Nathan Sivan, quote, macrocosm and microcosm became a single manifold, a set of mutually resonant systems of which the emperor was indispensable mediator, unquote. Within this dominant worldview of the Chinese imperial system, bodies become ill because they're organically connected to other dysfunctional bodies. All kinds of anomaly, whether it be irregularities in nature, failures in agriculture, or rampant disease, all are potentially connected to each other and to the faults of the ruler. One of the principles underlying this system of resonances is that things of the same kind arise in response to each other. As articulated by the early thinker Dong Zhongshu in the 2nd century BCE, social ills as well as disruptions in the natural world, things like epidemics, can be traced to the misdeeds of the ruler. The ruler's possible transgressions encompass lewdness, ignoring government duties, slack attention to the timing of great affairs, sending gifts to the undeserving, letting women run the government, rushing the army into battle, and treating common people with contempt. Another omission impacting public health is the neglect of ritual duties by the ruler. As stated at the very end of the quotation you see here, when the ruler slouches in his ceremonial obligations at his ancestral temple and at altars to the gods of state religion, then, quote, the common people will suffer the illnesses of weeping swellings, dropsy, paralysis, rheumatism, and constipation. How did Buddhists explain epidemics? Buddhist rationalizations focusing on epidemics combine the doctrine of karmic retribution with other mechanisms. Perhaps the clearest example of Buddhist speculation on public health is the concept of an eon, or a kalpa in Buddhist language, a kalpa of epidemics. This inconceivably long period of collective illness is one of 3 epochs of misery. The other 2 are marked by incessant warfare and perpetual famine, respectively. The world passes through an eon of epidemics because people have not yet fully cleansed their lives of the baleful results of past evil actions. The basic idea is that bad deeds linger for a very long time. Buddhist theories supplement this ideology of cause and effect with an explanation of how the effects are formed, how they come into existence. The agents of communal illness are demons who use various technologies to spread disease. Some fiends emit foul vapors that sicken people. Others bewitch people or possess them, driving them insane. In one of the most frequently cited texts on cosmology and Chinese Buddhism, the Buddha warns that because people are deficient in their practice, non-humans will, quote, emit calamitous vapor, giving rise to rampant epidemics, resulting in many people dying from sickness, unquote. In addition, the Buddha warns, as you see on this slide, innumerable non-humans from other realms will come to this world and create all kinds of epidemics among people. Why? Because people are negligent and fail to practice in accord with the Dharma. Non-humans steal their spirit and strike them forcibly, causing them to go crazy. Among them, many get sick and die. To summarize then, in medieval China, sickness in the form of epidemic was considered a community problem, not merely an individual affliction. The 2 major paradigms for epidemics, from traditional Chinese thought on the one hand and Buddhist philosophy on the other, were based, both of them, on a correspondence between microcosm and macrocosm, in which the king played an outsized role. Epidemicity involved both religious and governmental systems. Furthermore, the 2 models were internally complex, capable of manipulation and mixing. The epidemic discourses were not static. Rather, they entailed both theory and practice, ideas and institutions. As we'll now see, composers and performers of the liturgies drew on these patterns and also worked their own innovations. We're fortunate that among the thousands of liturgical manuscripts surviving in the Dunhuang corpus, several deal directly with epidemics. I didn't know this because I wasn't looking for them before the year 2020, but I started looking for them in the year 2020, and lo and behold, there are 6 of them that are specifically, that is wholly dedicated to epidemics. They typically offer some explanation of the arising of epidemics. One common diagnosis identifies the environmental factors and disturbances in the spirit world that cause collective sicknesses. One of the shortest epidemic liturgies reads, as you see here, it's titled Epidemic, and we're going to read the first stanza from it now, and I'm going to read the second stanza from it in a minute. It's not on another slide. So the first stanza of this short epidemic liturgy reads, it's titled Epidemic. Bing. And now a great vortex of drifting ether, many long beset by miasma. A huge circulation of monstrous fumes, stirring injury from an epidemic. The piece opens with a description and diagnosis of the problem, at once environmental and demonic. The language invokes traditional terminology for noxious air, Zhangli. This explanation for communal illness is combined with a more animistic viewpoint. The second line of the couplet describes monstrous fumes, evoking not only an unlucky atmosphere and bizarre forces in the abstract, but also quintessentially evil demons and monsters. Another epidemic, which I've cited here as liturgical text 7, invokes the doctrine of shared karma to explain the origin of epidemics. First, the text highlights the repercussions of the epidemics on social life, alluding to shortages of medicine and fear of public spaces. Then it invokes the doctrine of shared karma to explain why all people in a given community suffer from the same disease. This idea is based on the distinction between actions with an individual valence, for which individuals bear the results discreetly, versus the type of deeds shared among people, which in turn give rise to shared karmic consequences. Found across a wide range of Buddhist philosophies and exegetical traditions, whether Abhidharma, Yogacara, or Pure Land, the concept of shared karma was used to explain how people have the same experience of features of the natural world, despite individuals being headed in different karmic directions, owing to our differentiated karmic pasts. This text reads, liturgical text 7, recently, seasonal illness breaks out and signs of death abound. A huge epidemic is in progress. All this is the shared karma of sentient beings. 1,000 doors are bolted dark, 10,000 households disturbed, not finding free-flowing medicine. How can we cure this withering sickness? Epidemic liturgies also contain sections that mobilize ritual resources to treat community illness. They employ one of the key methods for treating epidemics in pre-modern China, quarantine. But in this case, it's not sick people who are quarantined from healthy people. Instead, the pathogens themselves are the ones who are sent far away and walled off. One of the shortest epidemic liturgies contains this section. I've titled it Liturgical Text 8. Therefore, old and young are fearful, preparing a wondrous meal, the whole city stately, lining up a fragrant feast. We hope serious illness will end within the domain. wild ogres screened off and sent across the sea, and so forth, meaning the next section continues. Oops. Here, the liturgy turns to the rites undertaken by the community to end the epidemic. The text alludes to the tense mood in the city and uses stock phrases for a formal communal offering. The prayer conceives of the rites participants not as individuals, but rather as a collectivity. In its brief expression of wishes, the liturgy divulges a key mechanism for expelling illness. The monsters or monstrous illnesses shall be banished to ocean's end. Epidemic liturgies try to send contagion and its perpetrators as far away as possible, literally or figuratively, to the edge of the world. Rather than locking down healthy members of the population to prevent new infestations, the liturgy deports disease-bearing agents to another realm. Other liturgies invoke superpowers to zap epidemics and maintain the realm in good health. Liturgical text 9 relies on the logic of merit transfer I've talked about earlier. The bounty created by the donation is parlayed into a cure by being sent to the highest gods and their legions. These legions, the troops they command, are Brahma, Shukra, the 4 kings, and the 8 classes of beings, as well as gods well established in the pantheon of popular Chinese religion. The prayer section of the liturgy beseeches these agents to bestow a series of 5 boons, 5 gifts. The benefits are enumerated from top to bottom. Let's read through them. I'm going to read through all 5 of them. The first boon protects the Buddhist cosmos. It says, we pray that their magnificent brilliance be grand, their spiritual power overwhelming, they suppress the Saha world and protect the Dharma realm. The second boon is for the protection, so that's the Buddhist world in the broadest possible sense, the Buddhist cosmos. Within that cosmos is the nation state, whose protection is sought in the second boon. They meaning all of the deities under the command of the gods, they forge swords and lances to open farmland, bringing about 1,000 autumns without the worry of decline, putting an end to acts of war for 10,000 years. The third boon is sent to the local area suffering from the epidemic. It reads, may disasters disappear, epidemics be cured, the area united in happiness, ballads and songs be dignified. The fourth boon chases away demons through a combination of brute strength on the one hand and compassion on the other. It reads, we pray that the 4 kings protect the world, brandishing jeweled clubs to smash demons. We pray that great and holy Avalokiteshvara enact his vow of compassion and relieve our distress. And the fifth boon assures future longevity by resolving past enmities. It reads, we pray that enemies and creditors relinquish their bonds and save lives. Ghost kings who bring sickness concentrate on ending their anger. Heads of state be preserved in longevity as long-lived as Pengzu, the immortal, and the district be raised up and the people numerous, their protection ensured as if by goddess Magu. Sometimes the measures undertaken to rid the community of illness were thought to operate through cosmic resonance. One of the powerful regional governors I've referred to in earlier lectures, Cao Yuanzhong, sponsored Buddhist rituals to rid the area of an epidemic in the early 950s. The ritual section of his liturgy describes in unusual detail the oral performances undertaken by the Buddhist establishment. The text singles out the following: sutra chanting, singing the praises of the Buddha, reading liturgies aloud, and practicing confession. Another act alluded to in the program is the distribution of food to all sentient beings, with chanting and singing going on all night. The liturgy also references the profusion of lanterns and the burning of incense to honor the Buddha. The same liturgy not only describes the rituals administered by Buddhist monks, it also narrates the religious and cosmological reverberations of the performance. First come the moral effects of the rite. It will augment goodness and it will do away with evil. Next are allusions to the changes in the natural world that accompany merit making. So these two couplets read, colors cast by lanterns rival the brilliance of stars. Billowing incense smoke competes with clouds and mist. The tree of the way flourishes like a summer bud. Evil deeds scatter like autumn grass. At this time, the scene is alluring, the air is pure, the scent of orchids blooming furiously in pavilions, the fragrance of peaches and plums coursing through the woods. The last method for treating epidemics that I want to share with you today is a great example of the creativity of communities and their religious personnel in dealing with threats to public health. Two areas of synthesis are particularly noteworthy in this 10th century liturgy. One synthesis is the mixing of Buddhist ritual techniques performed on the altars of local deities. So we have Buddhist techniques, but they're being performed on altars in temples dedicated to local deities. Those of you studying Buddhism in other parts of Asia understand well how, from early times until now, the powerful spirits protecting local places, mountains, streams, trees, whole regions, nations, were often brought under the more powerful law of Buddhism in a process of back and forth and negotiation and sometimes struggle. Once vanquished by the Buddhas or his representatives, such tough guys, the local deities, enlist as protectors of the Dharma and serve as local police. The other interesting synthesis is the addition of animal health, in particular the well-being of domestic livestock, to the concern with human health. An interesting question about animal welfare came up in my last lecture in the Q&A session, so this is in many ways a continuation of my answer to that question. This particular 10th century liturgy accompanied a Buddhist-style ritual, as I said, conducted at the shrine to an important god. It was the god at Mount Jinshan. So those of you who know the details of Dunhuang history in the early 10th century know that there was a very small new dynasty declared by one of the Cao rulers, the Cao family, Jinshan Guo, that lasted for, I think, four or 5 years in the Northwest. And that was based on Mount Jinshan, which is near the town of Shouchang, which is now near modern-day Zhejiang. The god of this locality, the god of Mount Jin, was sometimes portrayed as a powerful naga or dragon. His spirit was believed to control the surrounding area, and his cult was important. As I said, it was important during the founding of this short-lived would-be dynasty, but it was a long-standing cult. It pre-existed the founding of the state. It was well patronized by local folks as well as by local rulers for well over a couple hundred years. The aspirations directed toward animal disease in this liturgy come in the section that announces the purpose of the rite. The logic here in the text follows supernatural jurisdictions. Before addressing people and animals in general, the rite first supplicates the deities to vouchsafe the health of their respective realm. They request that the god of the area, Mount Jin, quash the other polities. The gods responsible for local waterways, in this case the Jade Maiden, and the god of a local lake, are tasked with overseeing the local gods of agriculture. The text begins, as you see in the first couplet. It starts, and now our military commissioner of Heshi Jiedushi, the minister, makes an offering. First, to the sacred presence on Mount Jin in order to settle distant tribes. To the Naga King Happiness, Nanda, to keep the winds moderate and responsive to the season. I'm sorry, I skipped a line. First to the sacred presence on Mount Jin in order to settle distant tribes. Next to the Jade Woman, Nu, and the god of Wowa Lake to preserve the purity of the gods of earth and grain. So following that, other gods, both local and Buddhist, are supposed to ensure general welfare and good weather. So the second couplet reads, we make an offering to the river gods and beasts of the sea to protect all the people of the realm, to the Naga King Happiness, Nanda, to keep the winds moderate and responsive to the season. The third couplet hopes for civil harmony and for animals to be free of epidemics. It reads, make an offering for people to be free of grief, never beset by the calamity of boundary disputes, for cows, horses, the 6 domestic animals, camels and sheep, their epidemics disappear and their poisons dissipate. In conclusion, this text's concern for disease among animals is a form of epidemic concern or epidemic awareness I haven't seen in other liturgies. Throughout the medieval period, we know that veterinary science and government offices often dealt with communicable diseases among animals. This ritual text makes clear that animal sickness, like human sickness, was considered a public health problem that could be addressed through ritual means. The liturgies we reviewed propose many ritual solutions for epidemic disease. By way of conclusion, I'd like to build on the analysis of how individuals are healed and reflect on the technologies applied to epidemics. First, obvious comparisons and contrasts with modern techniques against epidemics. Then I'll return to the premodern practices. One modern technique, consider this: give medicine for healing. But this is also a premodern practice. Traditional Chinese medicine, of course, has a long history, predating Western biomedicine, as advanced as any medical system in the world. But also, imperial governments of the past and Buddhist institutions of the past also sponsored significant medical institutions, institutions that dispensed, that maintained knowledge, passed on knowledge, maintained experimental practices, and collected and dispensed medical materia. These began with dynastic colleges of medicine for training doctors and canonizing medical books in the Chinese imperial system. But the Buddhist influence was equally strong, especially before the Sung dynasty. This wall painting is one of the prime activities encouraged by Buddhist literature on the fields of merit. One method for making merit, shown here in a pre-Sui dynasty illustration, so late 6th century, from Dunhuang, was to dispense medicine, which was an act of charity, for all who needed it. That is, dispensing medicine, stocking medicine for all who need it was one of the 7 fields of merit. It was one of 7 ways to make merit preached for lay people. So the modern technique we know of taking medicine, providing medicine, distributing medicine was also practiced in pre-modern times. How about hand washing? Something we know a lot about. How about hand washing and other forms of protecting against microbial infection? Was this practiced in the early period? Not so much. This pandemic era painting by a Hong Kong artist depicts hand washing of Avalokiteshvara. He's careful, as you can see, he's careful to wash all 1,000 of his hands, judging from the soap dispenser and wash basin in front of him, to say nothing of the lather that he's worked up in every one of his palms. What a model of disinfection. But it's not very congruent with pre-modern practices of hygiene. People everywhere in the world, then and now, wash their hands before eating, but pre-modern disinfection techniques were usually more symbolic and conceptual. Imagine being refreshed by a spring rain, or having a shampoo of melted butter being administered by a bodhisattva. That's cleansing. That's protecting against infection in the pre-modern period. How about face masks? The artist known as Banai Shunzi here shows the Jade Emperor quizzing the assembled pantheon about their COVID practices. Although their backs are to us, you can still make out poking around the sides of their faces toward their ears that they're all wearing face masks. In the bottom panel, one of them reports that the Buddha with 4 heads can't attend the gathering because he only has 3 face masks, so he can't mask up his 4th face. Pre-moderns wore masks, of course, and improvised head coverings to protect themselves from bad smells, from smoke and dust storms. But that was the extent of their protection from airborne pollution. Okay, how about quarantine? Here we see an early pandemic poster. The monkey, Sun Wukong from Journey to the West, draws a circle of protection around the other pilgrims. He warns them, don't go out. There are demons out there. As you remember, however, this model of protection against epidemics is largely absent in pre-modern religious thinking. There was, as we saw, a quarantining of sorts, but it didn't involve enforcing a closure around healthy people. Instead, Buddhist monks banished sickness-inducing demons to the far ends of the earth. They isolated the bad guys, not the healthy people. Returning now to the use of karma to deal with epidemics in traditional Chinese Buddhism. Pre-modern rituals rely primarily on 3 mechanisms, as we've seen: dedicating merit, assigning supernatural beings the task of suppressing epidemics, and paying off demons so that they cease inflicting sickness. In light of the two main paradigms I introduced earlier, I would argue that these three technologies draw from, while at the same time elaborate on, the traditional Chinese and Buddhist approaches to epidemics. All three ritual methods subscribe to an organismic worldview characteristic of both Chinese and Buddhist assumptions. The dedication of merit is premised on the linkages and conversions between different beings in the cosmos. Both Chinese and Buddhist cosmologies conceive of a world governed by a sovereign, whether a son of heaven, a dharma-supporting king, or all-powerful Buddha. They also allow for the delegation of authority to earthly or supernatural bureaucracies, and the rituals assign gods or higher demons the job of sweeping away epidemics or chasing off evil spirits. As we've seen, liturgies often combine ritual technologies. The modular nature of ritual makes it easy to insert a prayer asking deities for protection into a merit-making ritual. Similarly, even the most transactional offerings to ghosts and demons use the language of cause and result, or karma. So we see the flexible logic of karma at work again. Liturgies are also effective by deploying images their sponsors find convincing. In epidemic texts, these scenarios include banishing epidemics to the wilderness or ends of the earth, the exile metaphor, converting demons, a metaphor of conversion, mobilizing the Buddha's power to sterilize infection, the decontamination metaphor, and seeking the protection of local deities, which I would call, because I teach in New Jersey, I would call it a mafia metaphor. The contrast with modern disease control is also interesting. Both medieval and modern public health systems make use of isolation, but that which they isolate is different. In the medieval Chinese case, sick people in populations at high risk are not locked down or sent away. Instead, the illness itself, or its personified germ, is exiled. The Buddhist liturgies do not maintain the practice of masking. Rather, they imagine the sounds of chanting drifting through town and reverberating in the heavens. Some liturgies refer to the practice of confession, a public performance involving prostration, as well as the recitation of formulaic offenses. The liturgies show how ritual appeals to other senses as well. Recitation of formulaic offenses, lanterns cast colored light, incense smoke billows, the scent of flowers and fruit wafts through the air. What ritual techniques are missing in the pre-modern liturgies? The absence of Taoist techniques is conspicuous, but not unexpected, because the materials, after all, are mostly Buddhist liturgies. In many ways, the religious and medical techniques of medieval Taoism grew out of the chaos of epidemics, warfare, and political breakdown occurring at the end of the Han Dynasty in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era. The resulting Taoist methods for dealing with epidemics were various. They included gymnastic techniques, diet, confession, talismans, incantations, memorials addressed to the bureaucracy of the other world. We saw some of those in my first talk. Rites of community renewal, and various techniques of exorcism. With the exception of confession and exorcism, which overlap and reverberate and intermix with Buddhist techniques, none of these appear in the Buddhist liturgies for epidemics that were produced in Dunhuang. On the Buddhist side, what's absent? The tantric model of achieving union with a deity to achieve concrete goals is also absent from the liturgies that I'm examining. They exist in other Dunhuang liturgies from a slightly later time period and with a different cast of performers and characters and ritualists. In addition, the epidemic rituals do not recommend seeking a specialist to deploy more esoteric techniques, such as mantras, seals, or talismans, nor do these particular group of liturgies for epidemics broach visualization or the cultivation of specific mental states, samadhis. What then is the significance of ritual techniques in the liturgies that address epidemics? Overall, the methods appear diverse, and the methods are relatively accessible. The liturgies are based on the transfer of merit and making payments to deities and demons. They employ metaphors and refer to local deities that most people, I think, would have recognized. They also avoid secret techniques dependent on initiation, such as Buddhist esoteric teachings. The liturgies for epidemics employ non-technical methods, and they were compiled and performed by monks who were experts in generic Buddhist ritual. How do the liturgies for collective illness compare to the rituals for curing individual illness that I introduced earlier? In brief, the epidemic liturgies depend on a similar cast of characters and ritual techniques, but they enlist deities that are more menacing. They seek to banish pathogens, and when they speak of communal health, they imagine it happening pretty much in the near term rather than many lifetimes hence. I've taken enough time talking about illness and its cure, so I hope you can now share some of the merit with me and pose your questions, comments, and criticisms. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Teiser, for your very inspiring lecture. So the session is now open to the floor. Please raise your hand if you have any questions or comments. Yeah, Professor.
Yeah, thanks again for this wonderful talk, navigating us through a huge ocean of literature in a very understandable way. Thank you so much. I have one comment and one question. One is that there must have been some awareness that isolation helps in a situation of a contagious disease, as according to Tibetan biographies, lamas quoted a pandemic as an excuse not to have to travel to Beijing and meet the empire. I mean, whether it was only an excuse or not, but it must have been like a well-accepted excuse somehow. And the other one is, I would like to know a little bit more about the ritual specialists. Your liturgies, do they say something about the qualification of? You said monks were like performing them, but obviously they were not tantric monks, right? But did they have to be qualified in a particular way? Thank you.
Thank you. These are really interesting. I wonder too about isolation. Certainly, the trope, because the trope of I'm ill, or I'm observing mourning, or I'm not feeling well, or I want to avoid illness, and so I can't participate in government, is a very early on established in the Chinese tradition as it's always an acceptable excuse, canonized by Confucius and many other early figures. Is that a trope? Were they really ill? Were they really avoiding sickness? It's hard to judge. I base my description of this category of liturgist both on internal evidence to the manuscripts that I'm dealing with and on external evidence. The internal evidence is that many of the manuscripts, some of the manuscripts, they have the monk's name on them, and we can, number one, and they contain a lot of performance notes. That is, when we're doing a confession and for a nun and we have the sangha come to hear the confession. Is she included? is she included in the group that hears the confession or not, if it's her own confession? So they make these sorts of comments to themselves. So it's obviously it's a group of people who are, I would call them middle brow. They're not creating these pieces for fresh, anew, their own creation from the ground up. They're circulating and recopying and copying modules. Some of their anthologies, I believe, and I can show they used in performance. Others they used in composition. So that's what I would call largely internal evidence, because it's on this particular batch of manuscripts. There is a lot of external evidence from other Dunhuang manuscripts that's much more technical and detailed about their names, the offices that they held, and we have a fair amount of detail both during the period about the administrative institutional structure of Dunhuang monasteries, there were offices that oversaw rituals at the caves. There were offices that oversaw rituals at the 3 big monasteries. There were officers who were appointed by the government, monks appointed by the government, who collected all of not the tithes, but the ritual offerings at all the monasteries and took part of that for the whole Buddhist institution. So that's external evidence, but it's also within the Dunhuang manuscripts, and I rely on the wonderful work being done by colleagues, largely social historians of Chinese Buddhism. Interestingly, as you know, Dunhuang passes through rule by different polities and goes through different periods of history, where first it's closely aligned with the Central Chinese Court at the first half in the Sui and the first half of the Tang. At the Anlushan Rebellion, which cripples the Tang Dynasty, the Tibetan Empire also blossoms and sends its army eastward and occupies a territory that's the same size as the territory of the second half of the Tang. That's the period where there is tremendous detail in the Dunhuang materials for a scant 80 years about new institutions and very strong institutions, both within the monastery, each monastery, and among all the monasteries from the Tibetan government. So we have a lot of information about that, and many of those institutions that were established survived after the retreat of Tibet and the reclaiming of Dunhuang by Han, by local Chinese or Han military governors. And so for another 150 years, from something like 850 to the year 1000, very similar institutions persisted. And so we have information from these two I would call them very different periods, but a lot of information about how the institutions worked. Yeah. Oh, sorry. And they were different than tantric practitioners, because there's also a very important body of tantric liturgical material that survives from Dunhuang that is bilingual, some of it multilingual on the same manuscript, some of it simply we have a tantric ritual in Tibetan, and we have a similar tantric ritual in Chinese, and there's a lot of intermixing. That's a different group of people who are initiated. It's more esoteric, and much of it is based on a tantric model of ritual procedure. That's not this material.
Do we know of some persons who were successful in checking pandemics? I read in Tibetan life stories that some lamas, they could really remove a pandemic disease from a certain valley.
Yeah, we know in biography, we know outside of the Dunhuang area, the traditional sources for the history of Chinese Buddhism compiled essentially at the national level. They record hundreds of instances of monks who cure illness. Some, probably 50 of those hundreds, are specifically epidemics. So yes, we do. Do we know exactly what they did? Sometimes we do, but most of the times we don't. But their successes, of course, the Buddhist accounts usually record the successes of Buddhist monks and the failures of the Taoists and the failures of the imperial medical establishment. So we know of some successes, but we have to judge the source.
Thank you, Professor. So, any more questions? Feedback?
Yes, thank you very much. I was wondering how many monastics were also trained in Chinese medicine. Was that common to have monks who were in that dual role, both performing the rituals and also being trained as medical doctors? And the other thing I was wondering is if we take Spiro's threefold division of Buddhism as apotropaic, kammatic, and nibbanic, it would seem from the material you presented that predominantly it was a kammatic form of Buddhism that was being practiced here, although you do find elements of soteriology a little bit at the end and apotropaic at the beginning.
Thank you. These are interesting, important questions. Let me start with the second. I would say often all of the above. Apotropaic, turning away, right? Turning away evil, attracting good, banishing deities, controlling them in some way. Kammatic, karmic, accounts for both explaining how sickness arises, bad deeds in the past. Which ones, we don't know, but it's always there as a suspicion. And karma also explains the ritual mechanism of a good act producing a good deed, the consequences of which are shared, transferred. And nibbanic, finally, nirvana as a goal, is often there explicitly in the next stage. Yeah. Medical practice by Buddhist monks was your first question. Yes, there were famous, as you know from the Vinaya, and it's both Vinaya, the Vinaya known in Tibetan circles, translated I think in the 9th century, was also known in China. That is the Mulla Sarvastivada Vinaya. Was translated in China in the early 700s, but all Vinayas have a Bhaishajya section, have a medicine section, Bhaishajya Vastu. Most of the Vinayas have one. Certainly the Mulla Sarvastivada does. And so Buddhist monks transmitted knowledge of Indian medicine and illness and treating illness. And some monks specialized in it and followed it, but that was it was an elite practice. Number one. Number two, Buddhist monasteries did maintain stores of medicine, storehouses of medicine, medicinal materials, which of course required someone who knew either the Vinaya knowledge or the secular medical knowledge in order to actually practice it, right? It's like having a drugstore doesn't mean that you know how to prescribe. You also have to study pharmacy in order to know how to prescribe. So yes, there were some, but not that many. Interestingly, in later periods, especially in the Song Dynasty, and my colleague from Taiwan, Liu Shufan, has done really important work on Buddhist medicine during the Song Dynasty when it became even stronger before the state stepped in and took it over.
That's interesting because for in the Tibetan context, most of the Tibetan medical lineages were actually held by monastics.
Mm.
And of course later lay people as well, but I guess we don't find something similar. Chinese medicine, not so much Vinaya medicine or Buddhist medicine, but Chinese medicine was not necessarily practiced by monastics. Or was there no? There was separation, right? Chinese medicine was also.
There was in general a separation, but there was some overlap, and I would defer and refer to the specialist in the field, which is my colleague at Beijing University at Beida, Chen Ming, who has worked especially not only on the translation of Ayurveda into Indian medicine into Chinese, but also on the practice of Chinese Buddhist medicine by Chinese Buddhists. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. So, any other questions or feedback? The lady in the middle.
Thank you, Professor, for your wonderful lectures. So you showed us a lot of paintings in the Dunhuang Mogao grottos. I'm wondering, so are there any Dunhuang manuscripts or external sources that reveal the relationship between the painters or the craftsmen of these paintings with the monks or the ritual specialists, like how these paintings of curing rituals were conducted? Were these painters or craftsmen observe the process of the rituals, or they just follow the instructions of the monks or the ritual specialists? I'm wondering if there are any direct or indirect sources. Thank you.
Thank you. So the short answer is there's no good evidence linking them, showing that there was any interaction between painters and ritual specialists. The broader, so that's a kind of a negative answer, saying essentially we don't know. The evidence doesn't show us that. But if we take a couple steps further back and further away and look at the whole situation of who is producing art, ask the broader question, more and the important question, what kinds of people were producing art? What kinds of people were performing rituals? The general answer given by art historians more recently is that artisans followed other artisans. Artists followed other artists. Liturgists followed the Buddhist lore that they knew from growing up in the surrounding area, but also because they read a certain amount of Buddhist literature. And hence, whether there was any actual interaction between them, we don't know about, but it seems that artists followed artistic conventions, not textual conventions. The interesting cases are when there is a whole body of mythology that's reflected both in text and in art and in ritual. All three traditions, is how are they represented differently. So those are great case examples, and I encourage students and other scholars to pick those examples, because they can be very rich, and perhaps they can give you better answers than I've been able to give you.
Thank you. So, does the gentleman at the back has a question?
So good evening, Professor. Thank you for the wonderful lecture. So just a quick follow-up is quite similar to Professor Helke's question earlier, because when we deal with the notion of Chinese Buddhism, about the process of healing, so we have been talking a lot about the symbolic and the liturgical, that is a religious dimension of curing illnesses. But in the Buddhist tradition, there has been predecedences in the earlier traditions, like we have the Bojjhanga Sutras. We also have in the Theravada tradition, they have the Mangala Sutras. They have been praising. They have been using all these religious texts or rituals to pray for sort of a quick exit from the illness. But also in the Buddhist tradition, we have also a very heavy emphasis on the medical dimension. as Professor Helkias has mentioned, that we have a huge section of the Baisha Vastu in the Vinaya section of the Mulasavastivada Vinaya. We also have a lot of different Vinaya traditions. I mean, in the Pali, they have the Samanta Pasadika, where a huge portion is dedicated to the exemptions to the made to for the allowances about food and whatever. One of them is dedicated exclusively to the allowance of medicines. That shows a very practical and also a very huge knowledge among the Vinaya experts of that time about the medical conditions in India. Also on the Chinese side, we also have the Vinaya translations of the Dhammakuptaka, Savastivada, and also the Samithya schools. I mean, they have also parallels in those medical knowledges. But it's like Professor Helkias' point. So because when we deal with Chinese Buddhism, one of the themes is that of Sinicization. That is the transformation of these Indian practices in the Chinese context. So it seems that this type of very practical medical knowledges, when it go in the Indian side, when it goes to China, there's not an equal parallel that can be seen. I mean, you have quoted examples about the adaptation of some Buddhist Chinese medical terms in those prayers that is chanted. In those discovered in those manuscripts. But it seems that the portion when we compare the Indian medical involvement in the Buddhist literary texts and on one hand, and also the Chinese medical involvement in one hand, we see a big contrast. It seems, this is a point very similar to Professor Helkias' points here. So could you give some quick comments about that level of contrast? I mean, and what we can tell about the Sinicization process of Buddhism in China. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Sinicization is a wonderful but very big and potentially problematic. It's a very difficult concept to use with any specificity, and so I bump up against that often. So on the one hand, as you've shown us in detail, all China knew 5 Vinayas. Entire corpuses of Vinaya works by the beginning of the 8th century. All of the Indian Vinayas that contained, or 5 of the Indian Vinayas that contained sections on medicine, were translated into Chinese, and the Chinese monks knew that, and they were translated pretty carefully. So there's a tremendous amount of knowledge. At the same time, what else is translated? The Vinaya prohibitions on monks practicing medicine on lay people. They're also translated into Chinese, and they're enforced, but those prohibitions are also vacated. And we know this because constantly both monastic authorities in China and secular authorities repeatedly had to prohibit the same thing in their newly written laws. That is, they had to say, stop practicing medicine among lay people, right? This is repeated throughout. So it makes you wonder, if it's constantly being prohibited, doesn't that mean that people are constantly practicing it? So it's how do we judge what is Indian and what's Chinese in that case? How do we judge what's being truly transformed? The prohibition's there in the Indian literature as well, right? In the Indian Vinayas. You can't practice divination. You can't practice midwifery. You can't practice healing with lay people. You can't display a lot of others, all sorts of divination, all sorts of exorcism, allegedly is prohibited explicitly for monks to practice. But it's explicitly prohibited for centuries in a row. That prohibition is not just in the air, it's repeated. It has to be repeated and constantly. So is that something Indian that is changed by becoming Chinese? I'm not sure.
Thank you, Professor. Gentleman in the middle. Gentleman in the middle.
Hi, Professor Teiser. Thank you so much for the insightful presentation. I have a question on the source of illness from the Buddhist perspective. So in the first few liturgies, it mentions the four great elements, right? And later in the pandemics, I noticed the non-human influence is also mentioned. So what's the relationship between the four great elements, non-humans, and karma? Is there any text that mentions that relationship or that interaction, or what's your view on this? Thank you.
Thank you. The answer is there are many texts that explore the different factors involved in illness. I don't know them all, but a good place to start is the Moho Zhiguan of Zhi of Zhi of the 6th century Tiantai master Zhi, where he has several sections on illness, which he tries to lay out what kinds of illnesses are there, what kinds of curing techniques should be applied to which kinds of illness. If it's the Siddha, the Mahabhuta, the four great elements, if it's sickness caused by karma, if it's sickness caused by meditating too much, there's a meditation sickness, and so forth. And he tries to rationalize the system. He's not the only one. And there is now, in English, there's very good work undertaken some time ago already, for the past almost 15 years by Pierce Salguero, historian of Chinese Buddhist medicine, in his various anthologies and in his own work. But so there's no shortage of text. I've been specializing myself in treating illness with karma, and so I have looked at some of the more complicated medical texts, but not many of them. And so I'm going to pass that question on, or refer you to those other scholars who have done that work. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah, the lady in the middle.
Professor, I have a question. As we can imagine that not all illness can be cured, so is there any works in the Dunhuang manuscript that talk about how they help those end-of-life patients?
There are many places. A text that I published on it yet. I don't think I've published on it yet, but it's a Stein number 86. It's a long ritual program, and it's a beautiful. It's a 2-page manuscript. It's 2 pieces of paper pasted together, and it's made for a Ms. Ma Chou ugly lady, is her name. It's her given name, Ms. Ma. The rituals were started when she was ill, but the rituals were unsuccessful. That is, she passed away, and the rituals simply continued with a new purpose, and that is providing for her in the afterlife, and providing for her negotiating of the first 49 days after death as she passes in front of the kings of hell or the kings of purgatory. So it's a wonderful document, and it illustrates exactly what you're asking about. That is, what happens when the curing rituals failed and the patient dies? And the answer is, there are Buddhist techniques also based on karma that can be used for that next stretch, showing that disease, illness is part of suffering, but so is death, and so is rebirth, and so is providing for the next lifetime, or the next many lifetimes. So, thank you.
Thank you. So Any more questions? Feedback? Oh, okay. Venerable.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Thank you for showing so many Dunhuang tests to telling about the curing illness. I'm curious that are there any tests also telling about the great compassion water to cure illness?
中文怎么说？
大杯水。
大杯水。
Yes.
From 观音.
Yes.
Not that I know of.
Yeah, because nowadays this great compassion water is very popular, and I know that there are also many stories recording the successful curing illness. But I don't know when is this story history started, this great compassion water. So I'm curious to ask.
And it's called 大杯水.
大杯水, yeah.
And how is the water activated? Is it what makes it? How is it empowered?
Yeah, we like the monks or nuns or any lay people, when we chant the great compassion mantra with that water, and maybe one time or 7 times or 21 or 108, or maybe in the retreat in our monastery we'll chant 7 days, all the monastery and lay disciples together to chant for 7 days. And
So,
then,
go ahead, please.
Yeah, and then this water will become the great compassion water, and it's like the medicine for people to cure illness.
So the connection with the great compassion mantra and with Avalokiteshvara, I don't know I don't know when that begins, but I do know that in very early biographies, some of the biographies in the Gaosong Zhuan, written in the compiled in the 5th, 6th century, looking at even earlier periods, there is a technique of 注水, of saying an incantation over water and then using that administering that water for healing. That technique is mentioned for monks using that technique allegedly beginning in the 3rd and 4th centuries. So the broader technique is known and is practiced, and it's similar terminology. It's not specifically called a mantra. We don't really know what was said when the monks said an incantation over the water, but we do know monks use the technique. It's referred to over several hundred years with the same terminology, and monks performing the chanting. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Dr. Gao, we take it as the last question.
Okay, thank you for a nice talk. I would like to ask a question from a more medical way, because I'm a medical background. So to me, I think the way of the healing effect of Buddhism may be you may heard about the placebo effect. So yeah, actually placebo effect could be a powerful, is actually work on the psychological part, or we can see from the neuroscientific perspective that actually the brain has complicated networks that can affect the immune system and the blood system, and of course the psyche part. And another possibility is that the healing of Buddhism may be useful to specific disease like the affective disorder, like depression or psychiatric, because even nowadays the modern medicines, they don't have much good way to do that. That is why how the mindfulness is actually the practice, and it's turned out to I can't say cure, but reduce the symptoms of many chronic disease. So that seems more practical way. And I mean, nowadays, what do you think?
Well, I'm a humanist, and not a scientist, or I deal with human sciences rather than the medical sciences, and so I respect and take and abide by science as you and other doctors analyze it. What I do measure in terms of my study of Buddhist medicine, I do so as a humanistic scholar, and so I measure metaphors, and I measure performances. I look at the engagement of groups of people, not just medical procedures or scientific procedures or blood tests. And I look at just practices of visualization and imagination. And so I think there must be a lot of overlap, filling in more detail than the placebo effect, or looking at what medical science calls the placebo effect from a different perspective. Maybe we're talking about the same group of phenomena and from different perspectives. So I would say, I'd like to contribute or offer whatever perspectives from a humanistic side to the important scientific and medical work that's being done.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Professor, and thank you for all questions. While we are reaching the end of this lecture series, could we have another big round of applause to Professor Teiser?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your inspiring lectures, and we very much hope that we can have chance to learn more from you in the future. So we are very grateful to the Mama Charitable Foundation for its very generous support to make this lecture series possible. And thank you to you all for joining the lecture series this time. We hope to see you all again in our future events. Thank you and have a nice evening.